Hello again, YouTube. This is Peter with you once again, and today we're going to talk about everybody's favorite subject to bash, pop music. Except, holy plot twist, Batman, we are not going to talk about how today's pop music is so terrible and how the music of yesteryear is so much better, not only because those rants are a dime a dozen, but because this video is actually more or less the opposite about that. I want to talk about the things that I believe those rants consistently get wrong about popular music. So, get ready to swallow some bitter, jagged pills, because this is why people are wrong about pop music. Now let's start with the music of the past. Because when people talk about music history, they seem to view it through nostalgic, rose-colored glasses. And in pretty much all of these rants, there is some sort of unwritten rule in which you must verbally fillet the Beatles.
The Beatles had emerged having produced their 8th album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It would go on to sell over 32 million copies worldwide and be named the greatest album of all time by Rolling Stone magazine and many other publications.
Now here's the thing. Sgt. Pepper's is a great and monumental album that changed the face of music, yada yada yada, and blah blah blah. The Beatles are so great, the Beatles are wonderful, the Beatles are the greatest band ever. Okay, I think I've met my legal obligation to praise the Beatles, but let's get serious now. So let's talk about this, because it's interesting that he chose this particular album because it demonstrates my point perfectly. The year that Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band came out was 1967, and we can look at this thing called the Billboard Charts from the year 1967, and we'll see that it was there for every week of the... Oh, wait, it wasn't? Okay, hold on. Let me look at it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It appears that Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was on the Billboard Charts, top of the Billboard Charts, for 15 weeks. That's good. That's really respectable. Except, wait. No, let's scroll up here. The Monkees album, More the Monkees, was there for 18 weeks. And if you count up all the weeks that other Monkees albums were at the top of the Billboard Charts, they were on the top for 28 weeks. 28 weeks of the Monkees being the best-selling album, compared to the Beatles' 15. The Monkees, a band made up for a television show that was a kind of parody of the Beatles, outsold the Beatles the year of their seminal album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Yeah. There's nostalgia, in which the Beatles were the biggest and best band ever, and they totally dominated, and then there's the reality in which the Monkees were on the top of the charts for more weeks than the Beatles in 1967. Yeah, that's not what you were expecting, was it? In fact, this wonderful thing called the Billboard Charts can show us in pretty much any year that you want to name the top-selling albums, the top singles for that year, and while you will find great albums at the top of the charts, sometimes for only a couple of weeks, you'll also find bands that are, let's say, less well thought of today at the top of those charts far more often than those great bands of the past that everyone is so enamored with. The reality is that popular music, in one form or another, has always dominated. And we may think that there are dumb, mindless pop songs today, but guess what? In the past, there were also dumb, mindless pop songs. And those also did amazingly well in their day. One of my favorites is from 1992. People think back on 1992 as the year that Nirvana made it big. But if you look at the top singles for that year, the number 3 position, Jump by Kross, Kris Kross. This is one of those obscure things that I have to explain to basically anyone under 30, because if you're not at least 30 years old, you wouldn't even remember them as a one-hit wonder. So back in this awkward stage of rap starting to become mainstream with people like Will Smith, you know, everyone thinks of Will Smith as the greatest rapper who ever lived, right? So back around that time, there was these two teenage kids that wore their clothes backwards, and they were in a group called Kris Kross. Yeah, you just have to see this for yourself. Go watch the music video. This is YouTube. I'm sure you can find the music video for this. Right? That was really popular in 1992, like really, really popular, and is pretty much forgotten. The next time you're at a party or with your friends and you want to impress them, pull that one out. Pull out Kris Kross. You'll blow their minds, all right? They're going to be like, what in the hell is this? And you look throughout the singles charts, album charts, the stuff that you think was really popular was probably not as popular as you thought it was. Bad music was more popular than you'd like to admit, but over time, the crappy music gets filtered out. So the good albums from the 60s and 70s continue to be bought and listened to well into the current time, and the crappy music, well, you might still hear it on oldies stations or in various places, or some of it still gets sold. By and large, it sort of falls by the wayside, and that's that. The second major thing which people always seem to get wrong when they're talking about popular music involves technology, and it basically comes down to bashing Autotune, bashing computer recording, bashing samplers, and bashing synthesizers, drum machines, etc. Now, I want to split this in two parts because the most common thing you will hear is about Autotune. Allegedly, Autotune is a magic plugin which will turn a person who is basically incapable of singing into a perfect singer through computer magic. Now, here's the thing. Although it does improve some people's vocals, it is not what people seem to think it is. Correcting someone's pitch does not necessarily equate to a good vocal performance. In order to demonstrate this, I'm going to have to do something I would otherwise never do, which is basically to sing for something other than comedic effect. Normally, I only sing for comedic effect, but to demonstrate what Autotune can and can't do, I'm going to sing for you all. All right, so I'm going to sing two different versions of something. One in which I genuinely try to sing it as well as I can and then use pitch correction. And then another version in which I try and sing it very poorly and show that pitch correction won't save it. All right, so here we go. La 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 la. I'll never break your heart. I'll never let you down. Okay, that's probably not as good as I could sing, but first take, best take, whatever. Okay, now let me sing that same thing again. I'll never break your heart. I'll never let you down. And now you notice how not only did I drift way in and out of pitch, but also the timing was completely wrong. So let's do some Autotune magic. This is number 1 plus Autotune. I'll never break your heart. I'll never let you down. Okay, and now this is number 2 plus Autotune. I'll never break your heart. I'll never let you down. Okay, so full disclosure here, I did a little bit more than just add Autotune to those clips. I also added some other effects because, pro tip, vocal production is never just about adding pitch correction. Often it involves adding reverb, EQ, delay, chorus, harmonizers, and other sorts of effects to process the vocal to make it sound more interesting not just to correct the pitch. But that's not the important part here. I hope that that demonstrates that, number one, correcting the pitch doesn't necessarily make it good, even when I was trying to sing. Number two, when I was sounding like a completely tone-deaf, terrible singer, adding Autotune did not magically turn it into a good performance, because that's the thing, it just wasn't a good performance. Not only was the pitch all over the map, but the timing was completely wrong. So what's the actual secret to making mediocre singers into good singers? Well, it's not just Autotune or the other sorts of processing that I just mentioned. It's actually what they call comping. So imagine that I sang that part of the song. Instead of just once, I sang it maybe 10 or 15 times over, just kept singing the part over. And then, in the computer, taking the best little fragments of that, putting them all together into the perfect phrase. That's what they'll do for a song with singers. Instead of doing everything in a single take, or if they mess up a take, going back and doing the take all over again, they can just do the take multiple times and take the best pieces of that and put it all together into the best possible take from multiple takes, a technique known as comping. All of that being said, I think that this claim that popular music is flooded with people who can't sing without the aid of computer magic is by and large overstated. There are clearly examples where that is the case. On the other hand, there are plenty of pop singers who can genuinely sing, and the proof is out there. I'll return to the topic of the manufactured nature of pop stardom in a moment, but I want to move on, continuing talking about technology, and talk about samplers, synthesizers, computers, and all of that nonsense. So I was watching this video. It's a very popular video, got lots of views, and the guy in the video is talking about timbre or timbre, and how modern music has less timbral variety than music of the past. And he gives the example of the Beatles' The Day in the Life, in which they use a full orchestra. And then he says this.
Instead of experimenting with different musical techniques and instruments, the vast majority of pop today is built using the exact same combination of a keyboard, a drum machine, sampler, and computer software. This might be considered as progressive by some people, but in truth it sucks the creativity and originality out of music, making everything sound somewhat similar.
And it was then that I immediately thought that this person doesn't really know what he's talking about. I'm sorry, you seem like an alright guy if you ever happen to watch this video, but you're wrong. Let's talk about a sampler for a moment. A sampler is basically a way of playing back recorded music. Typically, it employs a musical playback device such as a keyboard or some sort of pad to trigger the sample. What this means in practical terms is probably best explained by a flowchart. It goes something like this. Is it a recordable sound? If the answer is yes, a sampler can play it back. If the answer is no, then you have to start asking questions like, well, wait, is it an audible sound? Are you sure you're talking about a sound? You can't record it? What? So, in other words, a sampler can pretty much play back anything you can possibly record. What does that mean in terms of timbre? Well, stop and think about that for a moment. If you can record it, you can play it back. So to say that the timbre of modern music is limited because they're using samplers is utterly ridiculous. Let's just look at this example that he gave about the Beatles having a full orchestra for one of their songs. Well, here's the thing. With a sampler, you might not be able to hire an orchestra, but you can create orchestral music that sounds incredibly believable with a sampler, because what modern sampling does is take very high quality recording, multi-sampled, and use that as the basis to replicate just about any sort of instrument you can think of. Originally, When samplers first came out in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a sampler, first commercially available sampler. It cost $20,000, which would be about $65,000 in today's money. It was called the Fairlight CSM, Computer Music Interface. And this thing had a stack of floppy disks that each contained a sound, and this was back when digital recording was very low bitrate, very low quality. It was used on some famous albums. You can probably buy the iTunes app version of this for like $5 on the Apple Store, but at the time it was a technological breakthrough and it was massively expensive. Flash forward to faster computers and hard drives measured in terabytes instead of kilobytes and megabytes, and you have a completely different situation. So instead of, like back in the day, they would record one single note on the piano, and the software in the sampler would pitch stretch that across the entire range of the keyboard. And for any other sample you can imagine, they would record one single recording of that and then pitch stretch that. Nowadays, they multi-sample everything. So they wouldn't just record one note on a piano, for example. They would record every note on the piano at multiple velocities with the pedals up and down, every variation they could think of, multiple microphones, all sorts of things, because space is easily available on computers nowadays, and digital recording has gotten vastly better. So when you play a high-quality sampler like Contact with a good recording of a grand piano, it sounds, at least in terms of recorded music, like a grand piano. You can create orchestral music. You can create any conceivable instrument has been sampled in detail and can be played back. There is absolutely no blaming the lack of timbral variety in modern music on a sampler. It is an absurd proposition the moment you actually understand what such devices are capable of. End of debate. Now you may say, wow, samplers are really wonderful and versatile, but what about synthesizers and drum machines? Aren't they a plague on music? And I remember seeing one kid in this video, and he said,
on the topic of why new music is terrible, it's because they don't use real instruments anymore. They use something called a synthesizer, or use computers, or something called Autotune, which is the worst invention ever.
Now look, I'm sorry to tell you this, but a synthesizer is an instrument. I don't know why you think it wouldn't be. I wonder what exactly this kid thinks a synthesizer is. Is it something where you press a button and music magically happens? It's not like that. It doesn't create music for you. It is a way of generating sound, typically played through a keyboard, because it's an instrument. Now, there are ways, being electronic music, to sequence it. But again, this happens to be one of those mind over matter things. 15-year-old kids who learn some guitar and think they're God's gift to life don't necessarily respect other ways of creating music that don't require hitting something with a stick or pressing your fingers to metal and strumming with a pick. There are more ways to make music than the standard rock instrument way. And amidst all of this discussion about how these technology is destroying modern music, there's a strange reluctance to actually accept and embrace new ways of creating music that might broaden the musical horizons of people, because they hear it used in specific genres of music like pop music and think, well, that's all there is to it. They don't explore it for themselves. They don't understand what a synthesizer is capable of, what a sampler is capable of, and all these other techniques that they could be using to make music, and they want to stick with the same instruments people have been using for decade after decade. And they also want music to be new and interesting and different.
Instead of experimenting with different musical techniques and instruments,
but they don't want to embrace the ways they could be making new and interesting and different music because of their own preconceived notions about what these instruments and techniques actually are. So now that we've established that the past is, well, not quite what you remember it to be, and that technology is not really to blame for the problems in popular music, let's talk about songwriting. Now, songwriting, of course, is something that is partially objective and partially subjective. And here, too, I think that people who criticize pop music both have valid points to make and have some hypocrisy and moving of the goalposts. On the valid arguments side of the equation, people often point out that many of the most popular songs of the last 20 years were basically all written by two people, Max Martin and Dr. Luke.
What if I also told you that the vast majority of chart-topping music in the past 20 years was written by just two people?
However, if you'll forgive me for being slightly pedantic for a moment, there's something I gotta point out.
And if Max Martin didn't write it, then American singer-songwriter Lucas Gottwald most probably did. Known professionally as Dr. Luke, together with Max Martin, they account for the lyrics and melodies behind the vast majority of pop music today.
No, that's actually only partially true. You see, although these two producers are the man behind the curtain for much of popular music, there is still another person even further behind the curtain, typically a woman, who is called a top leader, who is usually responsible for the vocals and the melodies and gets even less credit for creating the songs than these producers. So, for example, that woman who covers her face with her hair, Shea, is that her name, right? She was the top leader on a lot of famous songs and wrote the melodies and lyrics for them. The producer typically creates the bass line and the beat, and the top leader creates the melodies and lyrics. You would think that would be half the song, but the producer takes all the credit anyway, at least as far as royalties are concerned. All of that being said, I think it needs to be pointed out that the manufacturing of pop music, where you have a team of writers cranking out tunes to be performed by artists, is anything but new. From Tin Pan Alley to Motown to the modern-day super producers, this is the way a lot of music was created. When you stop and examine the issue, you see that a lot of this has to do with our own cultural expectations of music and musicians and what roles we see art and music playing in our society, and a whole host of cultural assumptions. So if you stop and compare music to movies, for example, in movies, although we do praise auteurs who both write and direct their own movies and occasionally star or at least have acting roles within their movies, someone like Quentin Tarantino comes to mind, we don't really expect it. We don't denigrate a movie because it was written by one person, directed by another person, and acted out by a whole group of other people. But when music has a division of labor, when the producer is different from the songwriter, is different from the performer, certain people regard that as fundamentally invalid. This is because many people regard their own relationship with music as deep and meaningful, in spite of the fact that most songs have only a Rorschach test type meaning to them anyway, but that's a rant for a different day. And so they regard music not made from a singular artist, not from the authentic intent of that artist, as being some violation of the relationship involved in music. That relationship is supposed to be built on authenticity in their mind, and when music is manufactured through a division of labor, much like a movie, that breaks the authenticity of the relationship and thus, in their mind, invalidates the music. But here's the thing. As I see it, I get that many people feel they have a deep relationship with music, an emotional connection. It's a part of them. It's part of the fabric of their life. But to those people listening to this video now that feel that way about music, I have to tell you something. It's another one of those bitter, jagged pills. Not everyone takes music as seriously as you do. In fact, if pop music is any indication, most people don't take music as seriously as you do. And that's why vapid, stupid music is so popular. That's why they don't care that it's manufactured by the same two producers. That's why they don't really care if Britney Spears can actually sing. Because popular music is the soundtrack to their vapid lives of partying in Ibiza or whatever. And you know what? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. My teenage self would have sneered at such people. My older, somewhat wiser self says, whatever, live and let live. Even I can occasionally accept the catchiness of many of these pop songs and just go with that instead of trying to be a curmudgeon who tells them how terrible their music is. But while we're on the subject of authenticity, let's talk about hypocrisy. Because have you ever noticed that there are certain people who will excuse things that they would criticize popular music for in bands that they like on the grounds of authenticity? You tend to find this in things like punk and DIY. So if a band makes simplistic songs using only 3 chords, if they can barely play their instruments, if they can't sing worth a damn, if their songs are repetitive and simple, all of that's okay because they're authentic. But any and all of those things will be used against pop music. Except for the lack of musical ability, because those producers who create pop music know what the hell they're doing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be making top-tier pop music with A-list performers. The reality is that many of the songs that you like by the bands that you think are good are actually musically simple and involve repetition and formula. There's nothing really wrong with this, but if you're going to criticize pop music for it, then you might want to consider the music that you do like a bit more carefully, unless you're only into Baroque music, in which case, okay, maybe you have a point. But you're also a pretentious douchebag. So to bring this all home, does modern pop music herald the downfall of civilization? I think not. In fact, I think this topic has a tendency to spiral out into outright melodrama.
Music as an art form is dying. It's being replaced by music which is a disposable product designed to sell, but not to inspire. So we shouldn't be so complacent in allowing systematic, cold, factory-produced music to dominate. Or else the beautiful, soulful and truly real music that we've all at some point loved and has been there with us through our darkest times and our happiest times could soon be a distant memory, never to be repeated.
Holy hyperbole, Batman. Music is dying. Really? I adamantly disagree, because in the 21st century, it has never been easier to create, distribute, discover, and listen to music. Pop music dominates for 2 reasons. Number 1, it has money behind it. Number 2, people are lazy. The tools to create music are in the hands of more people than ever, and those people have the means to distribute that music to more people than ever. New, original, authentic, whatever your criteria, it's out there. A lot of the people complaining about popular music seem stuck in a 20th century paradigm. They expect quality to correlate with success, and they want good music to be massively popular. And yet, that has always been a rigged game. I understand that there's a psychological appeal to having what you like be popular, because it gives you a sense of validation and a sense of communion with a larger whole, a connection with other people. But the flip side to that seems to be that when something is massively popular, but you don't like it, then you feel like an outsider, and that creates a certain amount of resentment, which causes people to lash out. And I think that much of this grumbling over pop music is motivated by a sense of resentment at not liking something that's popular and thus feeling like an outsider. My best advice is to say that there are just some things you have to learn to make your peace with, and bad pop music is probably one of them. So that's what I have to say about this issue. I want to end this video with a couple of book recommendations relevant to this subject. The first is called Dirty Little Secrets of the Recording Industry, Why So Much of Today's Music Sucks, and the second is called The Song Machine. Now, these two books pretty much go hand in hand. I would suggest reading one after the other if you decide to read them both. The first one is slightly dated because it was published around 10 years ago and mentions things like YouTube and Pandora only in passing towards the end of the book because those things were new when the book was being published. However, given the fact that it covers pretty much the entire history of recorded music, that's a wide enough scope to forgive the fact that it is not up to the absolute moment, whereas The Song Machine is more about the last 20 years of popular music and producers like Max Martin and Dr. Luke and K-pop and the modern manufacturing of music. And I've drawn on them implicitly throughout these videos, even if I didn't cite them directly. I've had a lot of their ideas in the back of my mind, so I got to give credit to both of those books. Interesting reads if you are interested in music, so check them out, and have a good whatever time it is.